with us, Jamie. This is fabulous. We're really excited to have you here. Our first guest on Thursdays with Procurement League was Sachin Kasture. And then we saw that he was interacting with you, and we were like, oh, if he's interacting with you, you must be a big amazing guy. So that's kind of what got to us, and like got us to you. And yeah, we're just really excited. We get to spend the next 60 minutes chatting with you about marketing procurement, the APAC region, and how do you handle the chaos of the market. So I'm really excited to chat with you for the next 60 minutes. Thank you everybody else for joining. I'm going to quickly take 30 seconds to do the best I can to introduce Jamie, and then I'm going to let him take over from there. I feel like people always do a better introduction of themselves. So Jamie, what I understand is that you're currently the client service director for Right Spend. I'm going to let you talk a little more about Right Spend, sure. but it's one of the world class. Like it's basically how you get the optimum value for your marketing spending. For the top brands come to you guys, and you guys are like the big players in the marketing procurement space. So you're leading client services there. Before that, what you and I have in common is you've also spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and so have I. So I'm interested to even dig into Hong Kong a little bit with you, and how Hong Kong gives you kind of, a purview into the Asia markets. Like it's almost like a bird's eye view. And you were there with BE Interactive. You were also managing APAC there. And you were doing commercial operations there, and before that you were in London. So you've kind of spent a lot of time in some really interesting countries and spaces, and a lot of time focusing on Asia and Asia Pacific. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and focus today on. But I'm going to let you introduce yourself in whichever way you want to.
Well, no, I appreciate that. I think that's a good introduction so far. And you mentioned obviously Sachin as well. I met him recently in person for the first time at the ProcureCon event in Singapore. It was really nice to actually see the community all get together again and share all the new insights of what was happening, how they've been managing what's been obviously a very difficult period for the world. So yeah, it was fantastic, and I'm really glad to be part of this community now as well, and hopefully contribute something and add some value and have some good conversations with those on the call. So thanks firstly for having me. And yeah, a little bit about myself. So I'm currently based in Singapore, have been now for just under 1 year. But prior to that, as you mentioned, I was living and working in Hong Kong. Slightly fortunate to get there. The circumstances was that the company I used to work for, which was a London headquartered company, they were expanding into Asia Pacific, and what I could see happening quite often in that company is those who had maybe abilities with certain languages or networks in certain markets were kind of given those opportunities to go and explore them, and so I felt a little envious of that, given my lack of additional languages and things like that as well. So had this opportunity to go to Asia, jumped at it, was supposed to be in Hong Kong for a year, and then ended up snowballing into what was 6 years. And yeah, as you mentioned, you live there as well. It's a fantastic city. I do miss it sometimes, but I also really love living in Singapore now. And as you mentioned, yeah, so like my background at V was e-commerce, so working with a lot of big brands, but also some SME size brands as well, on their website performance, seeing how can they identify and get more customers who land on the site, or prospect them from other places. And then this role has been a bit of a shift. It's a SaaS platform, but it's focused on marketing procurement. So procurement as an industry is still something I'm learning every day, and I'm really enjoying learning about. But the marketing element has remained, throughout my sort of career so far, working with agencies, and working with clients as well on how to improve the marketing spend. So yeah, happy to get into the conversation.
Amazing. No, I absolutely loved Hong Kong, and I feel like so I was in Jakarta. I used to spend a lot of time in Singapore before that, and before that I was in New York, and I was studying neurosciences and autism and giftedness. And that's what kind of got me to Hong Kong, and it just opened my eyes to the world, to China, to the West, to India, to Asia. It was just like a really, really good start. And I think like when the crash happened right before COVID, that's when I moved to India. So I'm excited to chat more. But like Jamie, let's start with, there's a lot of people here who see marketing procurement and how they see marketing procurement. So let's start off with you just defining, what does right spend do really, and what to you guys is marketing procurement?
Sure. So supposed to start off with, what does right spend do? They are a platform, as I mentioned, a SaaS platform, but at the heart of it, and I suppose maybe one of the USPs of the system, is the data. So the goal is really to support brands. I would say it skews towards those on the enterprise size businesses, but really any business who's spending a significant amount of investment on marketing, they can use this database to benchmark their performance against others within the same space. So there's a strong focus on marketing agencies, and there's an educational element that runs through it as well, which is around, what goes behind the scenes at agencies, because it can be a little bit of a black box. Sometimes businesses don't really have the insight into what happens. And from a procurement point of view, we find that essential because, there's an interesting and ever-evolving relationship between those agencies, those in procurement, and those in the marketing department. So ultimately, the CMO wants to extract the most value from their marketing campaigns. And so if they can do that without having a negative effect on the scope that they're running, without having to cut corners in that sense, then there's a great opportunity there really to get the most. And I suppose the beauty of the tool, I don't really want to be sitting here like trying to be all hard sell or anything like that, but the beauty is it can kind of work in different macro environment situations as well. So right now we're seeing, obviously, inflation is going up, there's recession in some markets, or talk of recession in other markets. So in that kind of environment, you will tend to see CFOs and COOs and so on starting to pull back on budgets. Marketing tends to be one of those first departments that takes the hit, unfortunately, even though statistics have shown that the businesses who do actually maintain or increase marketing spend do go on to be successful and more successful in the long term. But aside from that, by pulling back, obviously there's more of a spotlight on every dollar has to count, have to make it stretch. And so that's where the tool can come in useful. But equally, in a more bullish market, if things are improving and all of a sudden a CMO has an extra 10-20% of their budget to spend, they still want to see that go as far as possible, and so they can use the tool to do that too. So that's a little bit about it. I don't want to bore you all the details of every single thing, but yeah, happy to answer any questions.
So that sounds like a really strenuous job for you guys. I mean, I was talking to somebody, we had somebody on a call a few weeks ago who heads one of the biggest corporate investigation companies. And kind of he was talking about how important it is, but how stressful it can be. And I get the sense that, getting into the nitty-gritties of data collection, the insights of what goes on with different agencies can be very difficult. How do you guys do that? I mean, how objectively to an outsider would you explain you manage that?
Yeah, you raise a good point, and it is difficult, and there's an element of subjectivity to it. So I think that you have to have an open mind in these conversations. So the area we operate in can sometimes overlap with other businesses as well. So there's a couple of businesses out there that do things like media audits. So they'll come in after the fact, look at everything that's happened in maybe a year, 2 years, sometimes a 10-year period, and they're identifying where there's been big errors in terms of it hasn't matched up with what the contractor said. And I think you have to be, where I come back saying about being open-minded, it's around, you know, most businesses and most individuals at these businesses are doing these things with good intentions. So there's not necessarily, you know, sometimes there's talk in those conversations of, oh, okay, this is fraudulent, or you know, the agency is hiding information from the brand so that they can benefit, and actually that's not typically the case. And so it's important to come in with an open mind, but it's also important to review everything fully. And so what we try to do is to give the insight and the data of what's happening right now at an agency side, so that the brand can make an informed decision. And then ultimately we even say to them, you know, in a scenario where one of their partners may be, you know, the price is coming in significantly above the market average, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, they may be quite comfortable and willing to spend above that rate because they've got a partner that they work with who is delivering extremely good results, culturally a great fit with the business. You know, they almost feel like an extension of the brand in that sense. Maybe they've won some awards for campaigns that they've done as well. So personal recognition is another area of it as well. And motivation as well, you know. But in this sort of modern marketing environment, we see relationships are not necessarily lasting for many, many years. And there's that, you know, constant strive from a CMO to try and get the absolute most out of a campaign and to meet those standards. So really, yeah, it can be a very complex topic, and it involves a lot of open-mindedness, and also, you know, there has to be willingness from all sides to be as transparent as possible, because if there's not the transparency, then those relationships can't really be solid.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm gonna make this a little more complex than
Sure.
than what it is till now even. But my two questions are, Jamie, do you so you know that we live in a world today where everything can be bought, right? Awards can, like, I'm always getting all kinds of emails about, you know, you pay this much and like this award can be bought,
Yeah.
and this you know, like this review can be bought and all of that. So my two questions are, one, how do new players who might be fairly new in the industry but almost as expensive as someone with a lot of legacy make it into the market? And my second question is, how do you train your, since you're the director of client relations, how do you train your teams to really be astute and be open to seeing and understanding the changing trends of the market?
So just on the first question, you said about new players, in which context do you mean? Maybe like a new agency? Is that what
A
you
new
mean?
agency who might come with less, you know, just like a new face in the fashion scene or in the Hollywood scene, or, you know, like the same way a new client, new agency that comes in, which seems really promising, but you don't have enough data to back that up. How would you put that? Because everyone's learning from everyone. There's immense globalization going on.
Sure.
So that's one. And two, how do you then train your teams to really keep their eyes and ears and everything open to be able to procure them on your data set?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and the beauty, but possibly also the curse of a marketing agency is there are very low barriers to entry. Now, as a procurement professional, if you're direct procurement of materials, quite often if you want to buy materials from a particular vendor, they need to meet certain certifications, standards, you know, all sorts of things like that. They have to have all these things signed and agreed before you would even get in front of a conversation and do that. Whereas tomorrow I could literally set up an entity and say, right, I'm Jamie Marketing Agency. And in theory, there's nobody to challenge me and say, you're not a marketing agency. Of course, the reality is I then have to go and prove my value to businesses and where I could have an impact, and try to generate some business. And then off the back of that business, hope that, you know, the more business will come, maybe through word of mouth and so on. So I think that is something to be aware of in a procurement function, because any business in theory could call themselves an agency, and therefore good practices you need to do that investigation, that analysis. Realistically, though, what tends to happen, at least we see from the mid to large size clients that we work with, is they tend to work predominantly with agencies that are part of a holding company group. So for those who are unaware, there are about 4 or 5 very major holding companies in the world, headquartered in different places. So you have obviously Dentsu in Japan, WPP in the UK. You have Publicis, which is headquartered in France, for example, but they're global agencies, and they're very quick to identify talent and to try and bring them into their banner, into their umbrella. There's a really interesting umbrella picture, which I can share, a link in later on, from, I think it's R3 who put it together every year. And it shows you the vast scale of agencies that exist under these holding companies. And so in that sense, there is a lot of opportunity for someone who identifies a niche or has a specialism, has that expertise that they can add value to. And within a relatively short space of time, I say relative to maybe other businesses that I say have to go through certification and all these other processes, they could be acquired by one of these holding company agencies and be part of a larger group and be involved in campaigns, because a holding company agency will call upon other agencies in the group if needed for their specialism and their expertise. So the opportunity is very strong there, I think, for someone coming into it. I think the trends, like looking a little bit more Asia Pacific focused, what we're seeing now is influencer marketing or key opinion leaders, those types of marketing channels. They're seeing additional investment happening right now, and those where it would begin as you might be an individual with your Instagram following, and you build up a loyal base of people who are interested in what you have to say, and you may have 1 or 2 conversations with brands who think, okay, my product is a good fit for your audience. That starts to happen. But then that some of these influencers are then being collaborating with, say, a PR agency who has a lot more global scope and clout and things like that to take advantage of as well. So that industry is maturing and becoming a bit more structured as well. So we'll see probably additional investment from large businesses in that side of things too. And then just to recap again, sorry, with the second question on that you had of that 2-part
about your team. So I mean, there's a lot of cutthroat competition. There's a big umbrella that I'm hearing that you guys have to constantly be under, but also manage and see what's going on where. How do you manage, how do you train your teams to work through these layers that sit in marketing procurement?
Well, we're fortunate at RightSpend, at least, that we have a lot of very experienced people to call on. Like myself as well, I'm very thankful. Our CEO has got over 15 years experience working at marketing agencies. Our Europe lead has also got in the region of 10 to 15 years of experience working at marketing agencies too. Our US lead has worked in a marketing procurement role at brands like IBM and Intercontinental Hotels and so on. So I think having that real world experience really helps everybody within the business to be able to identify, what are the challenges and pain points that those in marketing procurement have, but also what are the challenges, what are the commercial structures, what are the just general tips and learnings of what happens at an agency side as well, so that we can really get that big picture. The teams internally have that knowledge, which we can then share with the clients that we interact with. We touched a little bit about what RightSpend is as a platform, but really there's a lot of consulting that kind of underpins that as well. We will have weekly, bi-weekly conversations with clients where they might just say to us, right, this is a project I'm working on or I'm about to work on. How would you tackle it? Or what would you say to them? Or the agency has told us this, what's your reply? And all those things are opportunities for us to learn, more ways to handle objections, more ways to try and find solutions for them as well. So always evolving, very exciting. It is difficult for us. Our team in Asia Pacific is small right now, but we're trying to grow it. We're in the process of hiring additional personnel, but we're a little bit more mature in Europe and the US. So hopefully that will continue to trend in a positive fashion as well.
Awesome. So Jamie, I didn't take the demo on your website, and I don't think anyone here has. But could you kind of bring to life what would it look like? Like if somebody was to hire RightSpan or work with RightSpan, what would it actually look like if it were to come to life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's recently actually undergone a little bit of a facelift, I guess. So it's had some additional graphs and things like that. Interactive charts are going in the system. But really, when you log in, you get a dashboard, which gives you a snapshot of your global performance. A lot of the brands that we work with are global. So they will have their performance by market, their performance by discipline. And to clarify, by discipline, it could be a creative agency, a media agency, a PR agency, events agencies, things like that. And also by the opportunities there as well. So that snapshot. The main usage of the tool is a tab called benchmark, where a user can come in and immediately they have the option to pull, from a drop-down list, they can pick one of 75 markets in the system. So some of the markets are city level. So in the US, there's like 14 cities worth of data. You could benchmark what happens in Dallas versus New York, for example. And then in other markets, we have it at a country level. And then you can go deeper and deeper. So you can get that sort of top-down view of what's happening across departments and roles. So titles, hourly rates, things like that. And then you can go in a little bit more specific detail and go into very specific roles. You can look at assets in the system. So we define an asset like a project. So if you were going to do a social media campaign, or you're going to do a TV advert or a brochure you're going to produce, those types of assets or deliverables that people would call them, within the industry, you can actually see what is the benchmark time that this should take to do an agency side, and what is the cost that goes into it. And you can break that out as well and expand on it and see, okay, within a social media campaign, is it 30 hours of a social media manager and 10 hours of a graphic designer, and maybe 20 hours of a project manager, things like that. And so you get the real rich detail. So you can go high level, or then you can go in more detail if you want to get into the thick of it, I guess. And that way, that level of detail helps then those in procurement to come back to the table with their agencies and say, look, we have more of an understanding now of what goes on your projects. We can, let's discuss some of these areas. Is it maybe the seniority of the team? Should it be less senior because maybe it's over indexed or something like that? Or is it a time thing? You tell us it's going to take 200 hours, but the benchmark says it should be 100 hours. So what else is going into that 100 hours? There's a lot of information they can pull out of it. And that's the kind of the download part. And then the upload part is the bill plan function, where they can add in a scope of work into the system. So a project could be a tender. So a lot of businesses use the tool when they're doing an RFP, or request for proposal. They might put in 3 or 4 different quotes, and then they can look at them all side by side, very quickly get a view. How do they all stack up against the market benchmark, and see how they can, generate some efficiencies. So those are the 2 key parts of the tool. We're always trying to see how we can evolve it. So things that are on the horizon are looking at having RFP functionality within the tool. So you could actually almost run your RFP through the system. We've already recently integrated an evaluation tool, which is for your 360-degree appraisals of your agencies. So you can get that qualitative feedback alongside the data, so that decisions are not just made on numbers. There's the other part that kind of goes into it. And then just having more educational content, more resources. There's a whole library of white papers and best practice guides, things that we pull in from other industry bodies as well. So you could spend a bit of time, if you have a quieter afternoon, and maybe sit and have a read of some of these remuneration guides or agency commercial structures, things like that. So it sounds like it might not be so exciting for some people, but it can be really interesting and really help them. As I said, we want them to get on an equal footing with their agencies, so that the conversation flows better. There's no one kind of dominating the other party or anything like that.
Yeah, I saw that. I thought it's a really, really like it's not like a live negotiation, but it's all there for you to sit back
Mm.
and pick and choose from, which I think is like settling in a way. All right, Jamie. So my biggest interest for this conversation was the APAC region. You know, I'm always very curiously looking at global trends, and I keep looking at what is going on in the West and what is going on in Asia Pacific, and how are we keeping up and how are we losing out, and
Mm.
what would the Asia Pacific region, now that we're so highly digitalized, need to do more to match up with the West, and will we ever be able to? I mean, in every space, right from cinema to marketing to education to everything. I mean, I've lived across so many countries. I studied in New York, and I still don't think India is anywhere close to the education that I got there. And I keep like benchmarking my own life experiences, but it's also like evolving and changing a lot. So I'm curious, what do
Mm.
you see? Where do you see Asia Pacific as a market? Especially when you're benchmarking agencies and all of that, as compared to other places.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, I love Asia Pacific as a market. I wouldn't be here for nearly a decade of my life if I didn't. It's not just from a personal point of view, but I think I've seen in that time just how significant the growth has been. I think where maybe if I'm being more broad, I'm not just talking about marketing procurement or agencies or anything like that. I think where maybe Asia Pacific can slightly lag behind other global players, I suppose, is that they've created some amazing brands, businesses, technologies, and so on. But for the most part, they've remained within those individual markets. So I suppose what I'd hope and love to see in the future is that ambition of a, I suppose to an extent you might say, so like Alibaba, for example, huge in China, probably one of the biggest in China, but not so huge outside of China. But the market could work, right? Could very much compete toe to toe with an Amazon or an eBay or something like that in another space in a Western market. So I'd love to see that ambition from some businesses of that scale to really start penetrate into other markets. Because I think that there's a lot that can have a knock-on impact, right? Competition breeds better products for the customers ultimately. So us as end users should benefit from, Amazon are a pretty unique beast in the sense that culturally they're so kind of driven for innovation and so on, but there probably will come a point where they will feel complacency will begin to set in to some extent, and you need other businesses players to kind of come in that space and challenge that and so on. And so that's what I'd like to see a little bit more Asia Pacific. But yeah, the innovation is amazing. I'm very sort of e-commerce and digitally focused. Mobile commerce has led the way in Asia Pacific compared to any other market in the world. Social commerce and just social media in general. So I saw a stat recently, Indonesia has 96% penetration of Facebook in the country, and that's over 200 million population in one country. So just the sheer volume, there are more people living in Asia Pacific in the world than the rest of the world combined. So I'd love to see Asia Pacific as a region taking the lead in certain areas, and I feel like that's beginning to happen from a digital point of view for sure. What we see there, and India is one of those markets as well that you see that as well. You see digital wallets, for example. India and China lead the way. I think 70% of the global e-wallets in the world are in those two countries. Big brands like Paytm, for example, that we're familiar with. Flipkart, Flipkart was so successful that they attracted the attention of Walmart, who, had to get involved in that. And Flipkart are having a really good go of trying to compete with Amazon, for example, who have such dominance in some markets. So yeah, I think support of those local brands is going to be really key. If I sort of pivot into Asia Pacific from a procurement point of view, I think there's a way to go in terms of maturity. So what we see from the statistics is they're around about the specialists in marketing procurement compared to the EMEA region, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa. But Asia Pacific has the second largest ad spend in the world, just behind the USA as a total. So in that sense, there's a huge opportunity here for those in procurement in a market which is only going to increase in that sense, and only going to get more refined in some areas. So I think there's a big opportunity for those who may be working in another field of procurement, who may be interested in getting involved in that side of things. There's a lot of opportunity there. So that's an area that we want to be a part of that as well, educating and empowering those individuals to show that there's a lot of value they can add. So I think Asia Pacific is a good market.
Can I ask you two questions here, which are kind of very related to what you're talking about?
Sure.
My two questions are, one, Jamie, in Asia Pacific, this is when I was in Hong Kong, but even in India, like just this evening, I was meeting my father for a coffee, and he's like, "Oh, have you downloaded this new app called Tata New? It's doing it."
Oh yeah, I saw that one.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, there's a lot of or my rickshaw driver would say something like, "I don't use Google Pay anymore. I use Paytm," right? Like there's a lot of excellent innovation happening because of competition, but there's sometimes just innovation in a bubble. We're just innovating because we can innovate, so we're innovating. There are thousands of food, good catering apps. There's thousands, there's just millions of everything, and everyone's trying really hard and hustling really hard. So do you see that this is true only of Asia Pacific, that there's so much China, India, all of us, that we're just innovating and competing because that's what we do, without it really leading to something? So that's part one. My second part is, when you're pulling out databases, when you're looking at agency benchmarking, what are some agencies that don't do well, and what are your insights? Why don't they do well?
Okay, so in the first one, I don't believe that's a unique element to Asia. I take your point, and I think that there is the environment, I suppose, of businesses these days. There's a lot of investment in businesses that are not necessarily generating returns or even profit in that sense, and so that and as the model continues to you see more businesses getting additional investment. They're talked about in the media. You look at someone like Airbnb or Uber, for example, big brands that are not generating that kind of revenue. And then even recently, there was like what we've seen in Asia, Food Panda, part of the Delivery Hero group. They've just opened a huge new office in Singapore for thousands of staff, and yet they also have just announced that they're laying off staff to keep themselves profitable. So I think there'll come a point with businesses around the world where that's happening, and the people, investors, whoever it is, people at the board level are going to turn around and say, we expect better results for it to be successful. And maybe as that model changes, it will probably cause a little bit of filtering, which happens at the startup level. So businesses, you kind of think, right, okay, I've got a great idea. It might just be a slight variation of something in the market right now, but if I can get that investment, then I can run with it and so on. And that model might change a little bit, because there'll be a greater scrutiny on are you actually delivering revenue for us or not? Time will tell, but I don't think that that's an Asia Pacific only area. But I think your point around how you met up with your grandfather, and it's a different app in a different market, so I suppose that's an element of marketing to an extent, right? It's being able to identify who your potential customers could be in another space, and inform them of what you are. So it's not the case that you're so surprised as you go somewhere else, but it's difficult. Like businesses will tend to focus on their comfort areas and their strength areas, which are going to be the markets that they sort of have more dominance in. But I think, as we touched on earlier, those businesses that we want to be ambitious and to be more globally focused, hopefully that will bridge that gap as well, and it won't be such a bubble in that regard. So yeah, I think it's an interesting topic for sure. And then on your second question around data and how I suppose what agencies are doing well versus which ones perhaps not so well. I think it's an interesting topic. I haven't experienced any agencies in particular that stand out as not doing well. I suppose on the flip side, there are some examples of agencies which are kind of commanding very premium prices on their campaigns. They're at a point where some agencies are simply sort of turning around to brands and saying, you don't really kind of match up with what we expect, or you want more than what we can deliver, and therefore we'll reject you. And so it's not necessarily like a buyer's market in that sense. If you're a brand, there has to be that fit, really, that real connection between both sides in that sense. So I suppose if you're seeing some agencies where they're regularly taking on work because they're slightly more desperate for that business in the hope that it's going to work out, but really it's not a good fit with the brand, then those are the ones that are going to struggle. The turnover will be higher. But even like the other thing I was thinking about when you asked the question is a holding company agency versus, say, a boutique agency. And in that instance, like, boutique agencies can have an edge over a holding company agency because they have the agility of being independent, small teams, don't have a large back office. They can reduce their overheads, especially now in the environment we're in a post-pandemic world where businesses can operate remotely and just call on teams from different places of the world, experts as they need them. Some agencies will have like a roster of almost consultants, which they'll bring in as and when they need to. So that's another area where there can be a competitive edge, where maybe that doesn't necessarily meet with the structure of a holding agency as well. But then you also, as a marketing agency, you also got the kind of, like the right word to call it, maybe encroachment, but the introduction of large consulting companies. So like an Accenture, for example, who have acquired Droga 5 agency. And so Accenture's history is with, more just general business consulting, not necessarily within the creative and advertising space in that sense, but they have that now as part of their remit. And that then sets a challenge to those other big 4, big 5 businesses I mentioned, like the Dentsus and the Publicists and the WPPs. It's like, well, hang on, Accenture will be there on hand to take your business if you're not going to deliver on it. And there has been some shifts of some really major brands who've gone to start working with them over the other traditional holding company agencies. So yeah, there's always there's a lot of competition there, and it's expected to deliver. You have to deliver really on those results.
Yeah, so Jamie, just like talking a little bit more about this, most times, an agency is only as good as the client and as good as the project. And sometimes that can create, an agency might be capable of doing a lot better than they did, but because the project or the client, the requirement was such that they ended up doing that. And that sometimes determines what happens, with how the agency is seen. Mm-hmm. What's your view on that? And do you see a lot of that?
So in the instance, like an agency, the expectation,
like they're a decent agency and they get, a project like there's a marathon. And there's only that much you can do. Whereas if somebody else gets a project which is feminism and climate change, and how would you put that together? So that smaller agency might just get a lot more global coverage because they got a very interesting topic, whereas a really good agency might not do that well because their topic was like, oh, we're having a disability rights marathon. So
Mhm.
do you see sometimes biases come in because of that? And just like from a zoomed out perspective, not from right span, but just from somebody who's been in the space of marketing procurement, how do you see, that work, and how do you see that kind of like that configure?
Yeah, I think there can be some biases in that sense, and that's something that I think procurement people are well placed to try and identify, because the beauty, I suppose, of the procurement department is that they are there to support many departments within the business, so they can take a slightly, neutral view in a sense back on things and identify that. Those in procurement these days are very focused on things to do with ESG, for example, and from a bias point of view, if it's to do with modern slavery or women's rights or LGBTQ plus rights, things like that, the businesses they're working with, do they match with the brand culture and so on? Those types of topics are best and well addressed by those in procurement, I believe. But there do exist biases because as people, we are biased as well. It's part of I've been reading some interesting recent books about just general sort of human, like the way the brain works in a sense. We use bias as a way to reduce the energy load on our brains. There's an interesting study of there's around sort of two parts to our brain, our fast thinking part of the brain and the slow considering one. Our fast brain is going to, if I say 2 + 2, you're going to know the answer is 4 because that's embedded within your mind. But if I ask you what's 862 times 36, you're going to really need to engage your other part of the brain and consider that and so on. And so I think if I apply that into the situation of agencies, there will be scenarios where individuals, could be the CMO, for example. We've seen this personally happening before, where the CMO is very good friends with the head of the agency. They could be even more than good friends. They could be cousins. They could be the godfather to the other person's child and so on. And so that's going to introduce a level of bias when that individual says, right, well, I like this person, I want to work with them as an agency, when, that they haven't necessarily answered the question, does that agency really fit with what the brand's expectations are? And it can go both ways in that sense. It's not just about, from an agency point of view, the brand has to have that step back and look at those types of things, but biases as well on looking at what's worked before, taking the kind of easy route, or biases in terms of not wanting to address a difficult topic because of the fear of, will it result in a PR backlash or something of that nature? Social media can kind of, explode in a very short period of time. We've seen that with brands who have made kind of cultural gaffes in China, for example, and the reaction that comes from that. So yeah, it can be very difficult in that sense. So that's where I just think, yeah, like when we work with good brands who have their procurement people involved early on, they have that ability to do the analysis of all the sides of things and look at the process a little bit more. They don't necessarily have that tight relationship that a marketing person might have with the agency, and so they can say, well, hang on, should we take a second look at this? They might not necessarily have enough of a voice to overcome that. It might still happen, right? But the more they kind of speak up and challenge those things, the hopefully you will eliminate some of those biases. But another way is with processes as well, really having good structure in place on what are the tiers when a procurement person becomes involved, and at what point, and what are the things that they focus on and so on. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer your question.
No, that's fabulous. That's fabulous, right? So Jamie, I used to lead a big team across in Hong Kong, and right before this, even in India, and I've done a lot of trainings on how do you manage unconscious bias, and what leads to unconscious bias. Is it the language, is it the color, it's the skin color, it's the background, is it the education, and how do you work through all of that? So I've spent a lot of time unpacking this. But I still keep, people who are put in the spotlight are always under a lot of fear of some sort sometimes. And sometimes that can work really well for them, and sometimes that can't. How, when right spend, does like a full unconsciously biased, data mining, you put companies there and you put agencies there, and somebody hires an agency and that agency doesn't perform to the level that, you had put them at, where does your responsibility come in, or is it just between the client and the agency then?
Being honest, it wouldn't come under our responsibility. We don't get involved in the negotiation part with agencies. So we surface the data to the brand, and so that they have the information to go into their conversations. The extent that we might sometimes give them some supporting material or wordings on how they can tackle it, to that extent. But if, for example, they picked an agency and then the performance wasn't up to par, I suppose that really the responsibility would lie with the parties involved, the brand and the agency, what went wrong. I suppose where we might be able to support that scenario is with the evaluation, the appraisal part that I touched on earlier, where you could do regular surveys of the team and not just externally, but internally as well. So that way you're asking the agency, like, what are we as a brand not doing very well? So there's one example, we've been working with Kraft Heinz globally, and they are doing pretty much quarterly appraisals of some of their key vendors that they work with. And, the feedback is great because the agency is able to come back and say, this is what we expect from you, brand, Kraft Heinz, this is what we expect in terms of improvement. And likewise, then Kraft Heinz can get the view of all their teams, junior and senior. They apply weighting. So obviously different, if you're the head of a department, I suppose the weighting might be a little bit more skewed towards that view, but they still open the conversation up and they can get that feedback. And if you do it regularly enough, you might even avoid that happening, right? So you wouldn't necessarily get in a situation where a year has passed and you're all disappointed with how it's gone, because you've been able to identify that quickly and bring fixes in. If you've done all of those things and it still doesn't meet the mark, then that can happen as well in a business environment. And hopefully bridges aren't burned and businesses can kind of move on to the next project. There'll be another budget and another focus, and there'll probably be something else to innovate in as well. So yeah, like hopefully that helps a little bit on your point.
That helps a lot. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any question at this point before I get into data mining? Anybody has any questions?
Hi, Devangana.
Hi, Bhavna, go for it. You always ask fabulous questions.
Hi, Jamie. So, the thing is that post-pandemic, there is lots of digital transformation, and expectations of clients are also increasing day by day, which is making the old truth wrong, like we were earlier competing with our competitors. Right now the truth is that we are competing with the best last experience of the customer. So every day we have to do better and better, and it's sometimes very stressful. So how to handle this situation? Please share your insights, Jamie.
Yeah, it's a good question and a good point as well. I feel your pain is difficult because I feel like the environment is changing very rapidly. There's one mindset which is like we're back to normal in a sense, and whatever normal is defined as, and then there's another mindset which is actually we have to learn from all the things that have happened over the pandemic and apply those into our day-to-day from a marketing point of view and so on. And yeah, it's I think it should be reasonable for a business to not place undue pressure on any individual and department to match the expectations of a pre-pandemic, because as we said, like those learnings, there's still things going on as well. There's still supply chain issues which we were discussing at the ProcureCon event in Singapore in July. Supply chain issues, the war in Ukraine, for example. There's still a trade war going on between the US and China, for example, which has an impact on supply chains and so on. this, COVID hasn't disappeared in a sense either. It's still very much there in some markets moving slowly out of it, and others are still kind of, going through vaccine rollouts and things like that as well. So there has to be an element of understanding when it comes to digital transformation and how, that will take time to bed in. I think as long as you as a department are communicating regularly and effectively with your teams around the challenges that you face and that side of things, then I think that's the most that you can really do in that regard. I think, there's some businesses that we've worked with that are very traditionally a bricks and mortar type business, and they've been slowly evolving into more digitalized functions. So more digital procurement, more digital commerce, digital things like inventory management, and just even how the teams are structured with remote working and so on. So these are big undertakings that businesses have to take, and there needs to be a period of time to integrate them. And I think it's only fair to tell all the macro factors when it comes to these types of things.
Jamie, can you hear us? We lost you for 3 seconds. Bhavna, yeah, go for it.
I said very true. Means every company, every agency should be given a chance to, deliver the best and keep up the client to its best expectation.
Guys, can I actually, like Bhavna and Jamie, play devil's advocate for a minute? And I know Shahina is here, but because I work with so many different kinds of like people, and just like I'm managing multiple little things all the time, and I feel like at the end of the day, while on the one side we can have a lot of empathy for our people, and you can't keep up, this is breaking and that is breaking and the world is breaking and the world is falling apart. Yes, at all times this is true. But on the other hand, I also feel like we're living in cutthroat times where it's survival of the fittest. And whenever I work with teams, I kind of make so yeah, I feel like we constantly have to juggle these two things, which is the world will always be falling apart, but there will always be people who will still keep doing. And where do you want to fall on this pendulum of sorts, and this escalator? So yeah.
Yeah, and sorry, on your point as well, Bhavana, what you mentioned about, I wouldn't necessarily say that we give a chance to every single agency. Really, you want to do a good assessment of them. You want to make sure that they're a good fit for your business. Cost is a big factor in it, of course, because it has to meet with your budgets, but there are other factors in it as well. The cultural fit, as I mentioned, the strategic bit, how creative are they as well? Some of these agencies can be very strategic, but they don't necessarily have the vision and the imagination. That's part of what you're paying for. I suppose marketing, there's an element of subjectivity to it, and it's not like a commodity where you can put a price on creativity. So you really have to assess all those different areas when you're selecting an agency, and not every agency, I suppose, to touch on your point, Devangana, like not every agency is going to rise to the top. Some are just they're going to fall apart, or maybe people will split off and go and work elsewhere, the good talent and so on. It's going to happen.
For sure. Okay, guys, I'm going to get into the last question and then I'll open it up to everybody else. But what's really interesting to me, Jamie, is there's a lot of data mining that you guys are always doing. I've studied academia, like I'm a researcher by education, so data makes me excited, but it also makes me really nervous. How do you do that, especially because you're constantly negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals, and you're putting out a lot of important salient information? How do you feel confident doing the data mining? How do you not lose all your sleep and all your hair doing that?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I should preface firstly by saying I'm quite a data enthusiast as well. I mean, it's pretty much been at the heart of the businesses that I've worked in my career. I wouldn't say that I'm a data expert necessarily in that sense, like a data scientist in that regard, but I've definitely taken the time to learn more into that craft. The regional CEO I used to work with at my previous company was very big on that. He used to read a lot of data science books. he would challenge us as a department when we were surfacing insights to clients and saying, look, these are outliers. We shouldn't be using that when we're talking about averages and so on. And that really helped, refine my thinking on the topic as well. And I've tried to take that mindset, I suppose, into what I do at RightSpend as well. But as a business, the way that we handle data is we have a team, firstly, who are there assessing the things like, so that the main data that could be input in the system would be like a rate card. So imagine that like a menu price for your staff, hourly rates and so on from an agency. That's one big area of data that could come through. And then the other area of data would be like a scope of work or a quote or a tender or something like that type of information. And that might be more detailed, which would say the total price is this, but what you're getting are these projects within. And if they're really good, then the projects will also break down this many hours of this team person's time and so on. So you really have that level of granularity. That doesn't always happen. But so what we have to make sure we do when we assess that is, firstly, has it been validated? So really checking with each of the brands to make sure that when they upload the data, they don't necessarily have to have, not everything that exists within their system has to be validated. They can use it as a drawing board. They can use it for these hypothetical scenarios. If you're a marketing person and you're planning 5 months in advance for your next budget, you want a tool where you can test that out as well, and you can do that. But then when it comes to something that's actually been confirmed and approved, that's the data that we're most interested in, because that tells the story of what's happened in that snapshot of time of a brand of a certain size with an agency in a particular market. And so we'll take that information and we'll make sure that whenever any of the benchmark data is in our system have to have at least 10 data points per person, per deliverable, per market, per discipline. So it's very specific in that sense. And what I see personally, like when I look at Asia Pacific, is there's areas we need to improve. So like Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, where there hasn't been as much significant spend in the tool, we don't have certain benchmarks. We haven't reached that minimum data point. So that's an important thing for the integrity as well, and the trust that people using the system, is that if we don't have enough information, we're not going to publish it because it's not going to be statistically relevant. So that's a big part of it. And then the other part is we use a 10% trim mean. So we're taking the top 10 and the bottom 10% off of our data so that we give users of the tool that middle 80%. And that way then that does still allow some flexibility. And that's what we always want to say to people, because they might skew on the higher end of that spectrum. They might have a more premium agency, or it's slightly more complex project that they're doing. And that way, then they can go to that higher level if they need to. But if not, then they can see within that range what should be achievable. And yeah, it's a difficult task. There's a lot of data that flows through the system. There's over $10 billion of spend, which goes through the tool on an annual basis. Some of the biggest brands in the world are using it. So part of my job, I guess, when I'm managing the client services part, is to support businesses and encourage them to put information in the system, because they can benefit by getting that side-by-side view. And then RightSpend can benefit because they also, we keep the data pool as up to date as possible and as rich with the latest information. And then another part of that really is just showing them the benefit of it as well. So having, making sure that it's validated and goes through the system. So recent trends, as I said, we update every quarter, have shown that in Asia Pacific that costs are trending upwards. Some markets, I think India was just over sort of something like 10.3% increase or something like that. China was another market which had seen a large increase. Some of the European markets, it was more like between maybe 1.6 to 3.2% type increases. And that information is useful if you're in procurement as well, because as I said, it's not always about taking the benchmark and then driving the price down. It could be validation. Right? We understand now agency pricing has gone up. Agencies are not necessarily as driven, the price levers there are not necessarily going to be by the cost of oil, for example, in the world, like other things might be. but there will be some increases in costs of living with inflation measures, whether that has an impact on salaries or overheads, things like that as well. We're seeing a decrease in some overheads where obviously businesses are reducing office space and they're having more work from home. So that overhead should hopefully be passed on to the customer as well. And so there's all these nice little tidbits of data which we can gather from the tool, and there's insights that can help paint more of a picture of what's going on in the market. So I think where we need to improve as a business is we need to be able to package that in a way that we can communicate that out to those who maybe have never had an interaction with RightSpend. Now you could use it if you have access, you can log in and see it, right? But putting out more white papers or infographics of that nature which touch on these high level points, because that can help, you know, just get the wheel turning when it comes to procurement, of understanding, okay, this information is out there. I still have frequent conversations on a weekly basis where people said, I didn't even know at all like this existed, because it is very niche. But, you know, the data is only going to get better, richer. You know, my ambition for Asia Pacific is to have that level of city data that we have in some of the other markets. Like I want Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, you know, Kolkata level benchmarks in India, for example. I want Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Chengdu, you know, I want that level in China as well, where the markets are so large and they're so different. Cost of living are different, legislation can be different in each of those provinces or states, and the data has to reflect that as well. So it needs to be better, but right now it's still very robust and is regularly reviewed.
Jamie, can I ask you a quick question before I'll open it and we'll wrap it up? Do you see agencies use this data to kind of up their game, and in which area, what, how? Like do you see agencies kind of dig into the benchmarking and actually like level up with the best? Do you see that happen?
Well, first, we don't give access to agencies of the tool. Only brands have it. So we only work client side. But on that point, I have seen some very recent examples where the level is increasing. So there was an example of a design agency, packaging design, and they put together like a media kit essentially. So like a PowerPoint presentation of maybe 10 pages or so. And within that, they were talking about the pricing of some of their work and so on. And then on the next slide, they were actually putting in competitor pricing as well. So they were starting to benchmark themselves within their materials and be more proactive in sharing that information with brands, which I think is really good. You know, then now where they get the data from, I don't know, and how accurate it is, I'm not sure. We'd need to verify those against our own databases, but it's a good start that agencies are being that a bit more transparent about it. And as I mentioned earlier on, I reiterated through the call, they might say, right, our prices are 20% more than these 3 or 4 other players, but this is why. We have the world-class talent. We've got the best creative director in the city or in the country. You know, they've won multiple awards, whatever it is. We have access to this technology. You know, some agencies have very unique technologies internally that only they have access to, or they have access to digital inventory that nobody else can get. So this is why they charge a premium and so on. So there's every reason why they can use that as a way to boast as well and share that information. But yes, it is starting to happen. I'd like to see more of it. And agencies would love to have access to our database. I've had many conversations where they said, yeah, we'd love to see this as well. But for neutrality, we try to keep it transparent.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I feel like the more I'm hearing you talk, the more I feel like you're such an important feature of the markets. And I don't know how big brands work without something like a RightSpend. So this is fabulous. Jamie, is there anything that you feel like we should have covered but we didn't?
I don't think so. I'm just trying to think about some of the bits that we spoke about ahead of the call. I think we've covered off most of the things, to be honest. Yeah. So yeah, just really want to encourage those on the call, if you have any interest or passion about marketing procurement, maybe you work in indirect procurement and marketing is just one part of it. You know, there's a lot of opportunity there. So, you know, happy to talk anytime afterwards. It doesn't have to be about anything RightSpend does, but I just like to talk about the industry as well, or just talk about marketing trends. Like sometimes I have calls with our clients and we just started talking about things to do with e-commerce, because it's just, I love having those conversations with these businesses, because the likelihood is one business has a challenge, then many others do too.
Yeah. No, it's excellent. It's really interesting with the work you guys do. So thank you so much for this. All right. So thank you so much, Jamie, for spending. I know it's much later for you. It must be like 10:30, 11 p.m. for you now.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much, everybody from various time zones who joined us today. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. I mean, I didn't get distracted for even 30 seconds. It was that intense and that's that interesting. So thank you so much, Jamie, for doing this with us, and really
Thanks for having me.
good luck for everything. Thank you.